Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about video games and the theater. This may sound like a weird thing, but I got a bunch of stories to tell. It'll make sense, and there's even some stuff we can learn from it. But let's just take a look at the video game business and theater business and look at how, at the very top, they're very similar. Both are groups of people, which are a mix of creatives, whether it's designers and, artists versus, actors and set designers, and a lot of technical people, whether it's programmers or people who do lighting or people who just know how to manage stage business. Both groups require a lot of discipline and are really helped if they have a good director. So right then you can see, okay, there's some similarities. Let me put a caveat on this. I am not a theater kid. I have never done theater except for some narrations I did in elementary school. But I've heard comparisons made to the video game industry and theater a lot over the last several decades. So I finally decided to dive into it. I actually was writing this when I heard someone at work mention something about this, which I added in below and I'll talk about. But let me talk about how this whole thing got started. I was reading something about how the theater business was booming. This was pre-COVID. It was booming, and yet 80% of theater productions were failing. There's a link below. Does this sound familiar? This sounds like the game industry, where how can it be doing so well, yet there are so many things that are coming out that aren't considered very good? Now, I did a video about how hard it is to make an IP in a new medium, and that's also linked below. And a friend had seen it, a friend who's in the industry, had seen that video and said, hey, I don't know if you know this, but the theater, especially musical theater, is the one area where adaptation rules supreme. And I went, what? So he sent me to a site, which I'll link below, kendavenport.com, which said the following things. And this is data over the past 30 years. Although this particular place, I believe this is 10 or 15 years ago. So it was 30 years ago, a decade ago. But over the previous 30 years from that article, 82% of the new musicals on Broadway were adaptations from other mediums. They were either from books or movies or something else. Only 18% were original musicals. The average run of the adaptations were 644 performances. The average run of the originals were only 331 performances, meaning they only did half as well as the adaptations. Of the original musicals produced in the last 30 years, 30% of them were opened for less than a month, so they did a lot less than 331 performances. In fact, 7 original musicals closed in their first week. So it's just tough. And as if that wasn't enough data, he went on to say that 83% of all of the best musical Tony Award winners in the past 30 years were adaptations. So clearly, adaptations are something that musical theater does really well. So it's not the case in that medium that adapting something from another medium is a tough thing to do. In fact, it seems to work really, really well for them. So it made me go, well, maybe games could learn how to do adaptations from the theater. Well, this led me to something else that someone from work had mentioned. It turns out that there was a study done at Northwestern a few years ago that basically was studying how team composition, specifically the experience of the team members, corresponded to a successful collaboration. It was called Team Assembly Mechanisms Determine Collaboration, Network Structure, and Team Performance. That's so academic. It was by Roger Guimara and others. I will link it below. You can go right to the PDF and read it yourself. But anyway, they studied team composition in two disparate areas in Broadway musicals and scientific papers. For the Broadway musicals, they studied all 2,258 productions in the period of 1877 all the way up to 1990. For the scientific writing collaborations, they looked at all the publications in several different fields. They looked at 7 social ecology journals, 9 economics journals, 10 ecology journals, and 6 astronomy journals. So widely different scientific disciplines with no overlap in the personnel. What they found, and I thought this was really, really interesting, and this is academic, so in other words, it's full of graphs and sigma values, and success was most correlated to having a mix of newcomers and veterans in the production, whether it was a musical theater piece or a scientific journal. What they found was teams of all newcomers tended to fail. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising is that teams of all veterans didn't do much better. They did better than all newcomers, but they didn't do as well as things that had a mix. And the mix was different depending on the different groups. You can go read the paper and get the exact percentage values yourself. But what they basically found was having a team of people who had experience and then adding some newcomers into that almost always improved the success chances of the resulting work. The new people tended to add more energy, new viewpoints, new ideas. Now, this is something that struck me as very interesting because when I did Fallout, we were viewed as a new team. And I mentioned this in another video. People always viewed me as the new guy, even though by the time I started in Fallout, making Fallout, I'd been in the industry for 13 years. So when there was somebody at Interplay said, I can't believe you got to be a producer so quickly. And I'm like, 13 years is a long time? You think that's not a long time? I've been doing this for 13 years. I think being able to run my own project should have eventually come along. So I was kind of the old guy. And a lot of people who worked there, because they were in their, some of them were in their late teens, but most of them were in their early 20s. And I was already, by the time we started on Fallout, I was already 28. I was an old guy. So you could view that as there was me, the old guy, with a few games behind me, and a few other people that had 1 or 2 games behind them, and then a lot of new people. This was like one of their first things they were ever working on. That was an interesting mix. I didn't realize it then. It was a complete accident, but that was great. So that was something that I thought was cool. And it's something that, hey, if it works in musical theater, maybe that's something else the game industry can and should learn about. And then there's one other thing. Towards the end of Outer Worlds, which took us 3.5 years to make, although the first 6 months, it was just Leonard and I, so let's say 3 years. Somebody who was new to the project, it was their very first game ever. He came to me and he said, hey, I know we're about to ship. Why do I feel sad? And I'm like, oh, that's normal. To me, I said, oh, that was totally normal. You always feel a little unhappy when a project ships. I discovered that there's something known in theater. It's called post-production depression or the post-show blues. This is a period of sadness at the end of a long project. It's where people have studied it. It's where you feel lost. You feel unsure of what to do next. You're worried about your career arc. What is this particular show or game going to do for my career? Or even is there going to be unemployment? If it does badly, am I going to get laid off? I mentioned this at a team meeting because that newcomer had brought it up. And a lot of people were like, no, you're dumb. That's not a thing. Arr. I don't know why people were so pushing back on this. But it was. It's even been compared, at least by one psychiatrist, to postpartum depression. And that psychiatrist even said, at least with postpartum depression, you still have the baby. Where for post-show blues, the thing you worked on so hard is gone. It's now gone and out of your control, and you don't get to be with it anymore. So that's something else that I thought, if these studies have been done for the theater, I wonder if they should be done for the game industry as well, because that's something else they have in common. You work for years on a game and the game ships, and then you kind of feel sad or lost, unstuck. You just don't know what to do with yourself. I get that. I totally get that. So anyway, I thought that was some really good lessons from theater. Namely, they're really good at making adaptations. They've learned to have a mix of new and experienced people. And after the show, you get a little sad, and it's been studied. So anyway, there's a bunch of links and references in the description if you want to follow up on any of this. I just thought it was a really interesting thing to realize how much overlap there was between the video game business and the theater business.